We begin with the crisis in Syria. Last night, President Obama delivered a speech outlining his support for a Russian plan to put Syria's chemical weapons under international control. This comes after a flurry of diplomatic traffic over the past few days, which saw Secretary of State John Kerry deliver what seemed like an offhanded proposal for Assad to hand over Syria's chemical weapons. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pushed Syria on the offer, which the Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim also accepted. Let's just take a look at a bit from Obama's speech last night.
The Russian government has indicated a willingness to join with the international community in pushing Assad to give up his chemical weapons. The Assad regime has now admitted that it has these weapons and even said they joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits their use. It's too early to tell whether this offer will succeed, and any agreement must verify that the Assad regime keeps its commitments. But this initiative has the potential to remove the threat of chemical weapons without the use of force, particularly because Russia is one of Assad's strongest allies.
Questions remain as to just how feasible that plan is, but luckily, joining me on set just happens to be none other than the former UN weapons inspector, Ambassador Richard Butler. Thanks for being here. Can I call you Richard
Please
instead of
do,
Ambassador?
Please,
You're
please,
Australian, I'm Australian. We're not a formal bunch.
Really.
First of all, before we get to the feasibility of the plan, what did you make of the speech overall?
It was what we expected to hear. There was a lot of that stuff in the front of the speech. And when I say stuff, I don't mean to disparage it, but the emotional appeal, dead children and the hideous use of gas and so on, which one expected to hear. But, you know, the American people and the Congress wanted to hear a bit more than that about exactly what a military strike would do. And I think, by the way, Josh, we're past the business of needing to know whether or not chemical weapons were used. And this brings in the Russians, because for some time they were saying there's no evidence for it. But their behaviour shows that they know that, and as do the Syrians.
Are we past the point, sorry to interrupt, of knowing that it was Assad's regime that did it?
Yeah, everyone's not talking about that anymore. That's a given. There's no other meaning to put on the Russian proposal and the Syrian agreement to it to allegedly yield up their chemical weapons than admission that Syria did have those weapons and that they used them. I don't think we'll hear Vladimir Putin say again, this is utter nonsense. That was the word he used only a week ago with respect to the events. Now, those are...
So in your professional opinion, just to nail you down on this, you're certain that the intel is strong, that this was Assad that did it wasn't the rebels?
Certain goes a tad far, Josh, because of what we've been through in the past. What we've been through in the past, you remember very well. I remember very well as the poor guy who used to chase those weapons in Iraq. But the case that says chemical weapons were used on the 21st of August with devastating effect, that this is against international law and any normal civilization, and that this was directed by the Syrian government, I think is well enough made. I don't think we're going to hear much argument about that anymore. So let's say the basic facts have been established. That's one of the things the Russian-Syrian move means. But back to the speech. That up front, the first portion of the speech dealing with those events was effective and touching and so on. But what the purpose of the speech was I think, rather I wouldn't say hopelessly, but rather extensively confused. Twice in the speech, the President said, we're not to be the policeman of the world. I don't want the United States to be the policeman of the world, and a point of view I agree with, by the way, and so does the rest of the world. But at the same time, let's face it, his speech was basically an application to give me the badge and gun, to allow me to be the policeman. And, you know, that's what I mean by confusion. And you saw that in public and other reaction too. People really wanted to know, why military action? Why now? Not about the norm, the law on chemical weapons. Everyone knows about that. It's a horror, right? But why now, and what will military action achieve? And quite frankly, he tried to go through those points, but I think the people, and therefore the Congress, remained essentially unconvinced, if not confused, about that.
Suppose that we put aside the only two possible reasons why you would go in militarily, which is probably humanitarian and maybe punitive. I mean, I think the only really compelling argument is that there has to be a line in the sand about this sort of stuff. If civilization is going to continue, we have to not tolerate certain kinds of behaviour, and gassing children is one of those
absolutely
things.
Yes. But you've just left out the key question. You say go in and do it, and this is a central point I would make. Yes, of course, the world should say no to such events. But here's the United States saying, we're the exceptional country. We must do this. If we don't do it, no one else will. That's what I robustly disagree with. That's the part of the speech I think that was quite wrong and is found to be so around the world. There is a system for preserving law, for bringing about justice. It's the system that works through the United Nations. It's legal. You know, under the Charter of the UN, what the President is proposing to do, pinprick or not, is actually illegal if the Security Council doesn't agree to it.
Yes, but they're not going to agree to it. So, I mean...
But what they might agree to, and this is what's really interesting now, but it's got some hooks in it, what they might agree to is the proposal made by Russia, allegedly agreed to by Syria, that Syria will yield up its chemical weapons and that they will be destroyed, and Syria will join the International Chemical Weapons Convention.
So let's talk about this, because in Australia you were very well known in the 90s and in the early 2000s in the lead up to the Iraq War. You were in charge of essentially hunting down Iraq's chemical and biological weapons. With what kind of level of certainty can we know exactly what Assad has? How do you trust him? How do you know where they're coming from? How do you know that he's not cheating you? Is this kind of plan actually feasible to enforce?
It's absolutely feasible given a couple of key conditions, and they're big, but they can be delivered if the Syrians and the Russians are prepared to deliver them. We did it in Iraq. In my last report to the Security Council on the Iraq operation, I was able to say we had, and this was the words in the Security Council resolution, destroyed, removed, or rendered harmless all of their weapons of mass destruction. I said there were a few exceptions, and they were in the chemical field. By the way, because we couldn't locate them, a few hundred shells. I was going to say, by the way, we had reason to believe that where they were, and why we couldn't locate them, was that Iraq had moved them to Syria, out of our reach. Now, these things need to happen, and this is what John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov have to design on Thursday in Geneva. Syria has to be obliged to declare honestly all of its holdings of these weapons. Inspectors need to be able to verify those declarations. You can't just trust them. You need to go on the basis of their declarations and verify whether they're accurate or not. And if that all comes together, then destroy them. That's what you need. It's a well-established procedure. We did it before in Iraq. We can do it again, provided there's compliance. Now, do I expect the Syrians to make honest declarations? I'd be surprised. Do I expect the verification process to unravel that and demonstrate where declarations have not been honest? Absolutely.
How does that happen? Suppose they have 150 kilos of sarin and they say they've got 120. How do we know that they're not declaring 30?
Because of the requirement of the materials that they need to make available to facilitate verification. They say, okay, we had 120 tons of sarin, right? We say, great, thank you so much for telling us that. Now, where did you make it? What was the throughput? What chemicals did you put in? What came out? Where did you get them from? Show us the documentation, show us the lab equipment, and above all, let us talk to the personnel who did that manufacture. If the inspectors can have access to that record, to the plant, to the personnel, the chances are exceedingly good that after a few weeks they go back to the Syrians and say, look, fellas, nice try, 120, but we figure from what we've seen that in fact it was 150, and we feel pretty convinced about that, so please now tell us where the other 30 is. And we encountered that problem repeatedly in Iraq, but basically we got through it.
Suppose that Assad agrees to this, having seen what happened to Gaddafi after Gaddafi relinquished his desire for unconventional weapons. Would it be a smart strategic move for Assad to comply?
If he wants to survive in power, Yes, I think he must comply. See how the issue, Josh, has shifted in just 2 or 3 days. At Petersburg, there was the G20, the 20 most powerful nations, saying, we don't want a military strike. Putin was still saying, this is utter nonsense to claim that Syria did this. He slung off at the British, you and I'll appreciate this, saying, what do they count? They're just a silly little irrelevant island and so on. All this sort of stuff took place. And then suddenly, all that political posturing and muscularity and so on stopped with a proposal to focus directly on the chemical weapons, not who's top dog in this Syrian area. Assad, the Russians, the Iranians in the background, the United States threatening to come in. Suddenly, the focus was shifted to the thing that we've been talking about now since August 21, those weapons as such. The bigger issue of getting peace in Syria is on the side for a moment, but it's a fundamental issue, okay? Suddenly we're looking at the weapons. A proposal has been made to let's put off fighting for now, military action, intervention, and let's look at those weapons. And I've already said to you now this morning, if that's an honest proposal, it can be done, and that would solve that problem. My hope is that it is done honestly. Syria has to get out of this, otherwise it's going to be destroyed. Assad will lose power. The Russians will lose a major asset that they're fostering in that area. Now, if that's done, then that might, I would hope, open the way to a wider political conversation on bringing an end to the Syrian civil war.
Is that an end? Is there any conceivable scenario in which Assad remains in power?
I suspect there is, at least for a while these.
See, this is the concern. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, there seemed to be a momentum to do something about this line in the sand. Now that Obama had to go to Congress, and I'm glad that he did, it's in the Constitution that only Congress can declare war. Now that he's gone there, you can feel the balloon gradually deflating. The question is Russia and Assad playing a game where they're willing to say, look, well, let's figure out some kind of complicated diplomatic solution that's going to kick the can down the road as the balloon deflates and deflates and deflates.
Absolutely possible.
And then after a few months, things aren't going to be exactly perfect, and the inspectors will be running around on a wild goose chase.
Why wouldn't they be tantalising themselves with that? We'll buy some time here and so on. My answer to that is call the Russian and Syrian cards up onto the table. Ignore and give no reply to this posturing about, but you must in return say that you're taking military strike off the table. No self-respecting person says that. You don't even answer the question. You say, hey, wait a minute. We're here to talk about chemical weapons. As a first, Syria has now confessed that it has them. You, Russia, by implication, have taken off the table, to use their phrase, any more posturing about whether or not the Syrian government used them. That's a given, okay? So now we're focused, perhaps like a laser, on the chemical weapons. Let's do that. And then we will see, as I say, calling their cards onto the table, the colour of their money. This poker thing's getting out of hand. But anyway, then we will see how serious...
All these love metaphors.
Then we will see how serious they are, because they will have to design and agree to the kind of inspection, verification and destruction system that I described. That's what the United States and the French and the British will be asking for. We want this to be an honest job. And then we will see the real integrity of this Russian-Syrian proposal. I'm not confident, Josh, that they'll go along with it. When they see how hard this is going to be, what they'll probably say is that, oh, this is too difficult. The country's in civil war. We couldn't guarantee the security or safety of inspectors and so on. Let's keep talking about this for a while and keep designing it and pushing it down the road.
And how should we respond to that?
Well, I think Obama has said that he'd not be prepared to take that. He's been big on red lines and threats and so on, and I think, unfortunately, he's put himself into a position where, you know, the pressure on him to show what he's made of, as it were. All these analogies are repugnant, I think, but to show whether it's man or mouse and so on. I mean, I think that pressure will build. Let me throw this into you, and I'm not a starry-eyed idealist. I've been around the tracks too many times for that. But, you know, there is a right way to do this and a wrong way, and the right way is for the United States to use its great power. I don't buy this exceptional thing, but I do certainly recognise that it's a great power, to use its great power in support of the UN system, the system that brings all in to demand an end to the Syrian nightmare. 2 million people in refugee camps, 7 million internally displaced, 100,000 dead. The world's people are actually saying, where's the UN? Why is it messing around with this chemical weapons thing, which is terrible, but why isn't it addressing that? I would love to see the President and this great country devote a lot more energy to the pursuit of solving those problems, while the Russians and the Syrians presumably stall on the detail of implementing their very own proposal on getting rid of chemical weapons.
Ambassador Richard Butler, thanks so much for stopping by. It's great to talk to you.
Good
great
to
meet
see you. Okay.